When Dorothy stood on her own front porch on Christmas morning, watching her son Michael change the locks through the frosted glass window, she felt the December cold seep into her bones in a way that had nothing to do with the weather. She knocked again, louder this time, and saw Veronica appear behind Michael with a smile that looked more like a sneer. Michael opened the door just wide enough to speak through the crack, his voice cold and formal like he was addressing a stranger. "Mom, you need to leave. This is our house now. We have the deed to prove it. If you don't leave, we'll call the police." Dorothy's hands were shaking, and not from the 28-degree temperature. For 12 years, she had given them $20,500 every single month, paid for their children's private school at $18,000 per year, and covered their medical bills totaling $67,000. She had supported them through Michael's failed business ventures and Veronica's shopping addiction. Now they were stealing her house, the home she had lived in for 43 years, the house her late husband had built with his own hands. Dorothy pulled out her phone with trembling fingers and said the words she never thought she would say about her own son. "Then I'll call them myself." I'm so glad you're here. If you're watching this video, please like and subscribe to my channel and tell me in the comments where you're listening from. Dorothy Chen had turned 68 years old 3 months before that terrible Christmas morning. She'd spent most of her life as an elementary school teacher in Portland, Oregon, teaching second graders how to read and write for 38 years before retiring at 65. Her husband Richard had been a contractor who specialized in custom home building. Together, they had raised 2 children, Michael and Susan, in the beautiful craftsman-style house that Richard had designed and built himself in 1981. It sat on 2 acres of land in a neighborhood that had gentrified over the decades, making the property worth far more than Richard could have imagined when he poured the foundation. Richard had died suddenly of a brain aneurysm 6 years ago, leaving Dorothy devastated but financially secure. He had life insurance worth $450,000, a retirement account with $280,000, and the house that was paid off and valued at approximately $850,000. Richard had been meticulous about their finances, and he left everything organized with clear instructions. The house was deeded solely in Dorothy's name after his death, and she had a will that divided everything equally between Michael and Susan. Dorothy had thought she was set for life, able to live comfortably on her teacher's pension and Richard's life insurance investment income. Michael had always been the challenging child. Even as a teenager, he had been entitled and demanding, always wanting the newest shoes or the fanciest gadgets. Richard had tried to instill a work ethic in him, making him earn money through chores and part-time jobs. But Michael always found ways to manipulate situations to his advantage. He had dropped out of college twice, started 3 different businesses that all failed within a year, and generally drifted through life expecting his parents to bail him out of every financial problem. When Michael was 30, he married Veronica Martinez, a woman who seemed to share his sense of entitlement. Veronica came from a wealthy family, but had been cut off financially after too many years of irresponsible spending and refusal to work. She saw Michael's family as a new source of funding, and she quickly learned that Dorothy was the easier target. Richard had been firm about boundaries, but Dorothy's motherly instincts made her vulnerable to manipulation. She wanted her son to be happy, wanted to help him succeed, and Veronica knew exactly how to exploit that weakness. The manipulation had started slowly 12 years ago, shortly after Michael and Veronica had their first child, a daughter they named Madison. They came to Dorothy with tears and desperation, explaining that they were behind on rent by 3 months and would be evicted with a newborn baby if Dorothy didn't help. Dorothy couldn't bear the thought of her granddaughter being homeless, so she paid the $3,600 in back rent. It felt like a one-time emergency, an isolated incident that any grandmother would handle. But it wasn't one time. The next month, they needed money for baby supplies, $400. The month after that, their car broke down and needed $100 and $200 in repairs. Then Veronica's medical bills from the pregnancy weren't fully covered by insurance, another $800. Each request came with tears, with promises that this was the last time, with assurances that Michael's new business venture was about to take off and they would pay Dorothy back. She believed them because she wanted to believe them. She wanted to think her son was just going through a rough patch and would eventually become the responsible adult she had raised him to be. When Richard was still alive, he had tried to stop Dorothy from constantly bailing out Michael. They had arguments about it, with Richard insisting that Michael needed to face consequences and learn to support his own family. Dorothy would defend Michael, saying he just needed a little more time and support. After one particularly heated argument, Richard had made Dorothy promise that she would set boundaries, that she would stop enabling Michael's irresponsibility. Dorothy had promised, but after Richard died, the promise became harder to keep. She was lonely, grieving, and her grandchildren gave her purpose. Michael and Veronica had 3 children in total: Madison, who was now 12, Tyler, who was 9, and Emma, who was 7. Dorothy loved those children with her whole heart. She babysat them at least twice a week, took them on trips to the zoo and the science museum, and showed up for every school play and sports game. The children loved her too, running to hug her whenever she arrived and begging her to read them stories or play games. Dorothy told herself that she wasn't just supporting Michael and Veronica, she was investing in her grandchildren's futures. The financial support had become a regular monthly payment of $2,500 that Michael said he needed for rent and basic expenses. Dorothy set up an automatic transfer from her account to his, justifying it as helping her grandchildren have a stable home. That monthly payment alone added up to $30,000 per year, $360,000 over the 12-year period. On top of the monthly $2,500, there were constant additional requests that Dorothy tracked meticulously in her ledger. The children's private school tuition at Westside Academy was $18,000 per year per child. With 3 children, that totaled $54,000 annually. Dorothy paid it directly to the school every August and January, splitting the payments into 2 installments. Over the years, the tuition had increased, and Dorothy had paid approximately $578,000 in total school expenses. She justified this enormous expense by telling herself she was investing in her grandchildren's futures, giving them opportunities she and Richard never had. Medical expenses were another constant drain. When Tyler broke his arm playing soccer and needed surgery with pins inserted, the insurance only covered 60% of the $38,000 bill. Dorothy paid the remaining $15,200 balance to the hospital. When Madison developed severe allergies and needed weekly immunotherapy injections for 2 years, the out-of-pocket costs were $8,400 total. When Emma was diagnosed with a learning disability and needed private tutoring, Dorothy paid $200 per week for 80 weeks, totaling $16,000. When Veronica had complications during Emma's birth and spent 5 days in intensive care, the insurance deductible and copays added up to $12,800 that Dorothy covered. Car problems seemed to happen with suspicious frequency. The transmission failure that cost $4,500 was just the beginning. 6 months later, the engine needed major repairs at $3,200. A year after that, they needed 4 new tires and a brake job, another $1,900. When Michael insisted he needed a more reliable vehicle for work and couldn't get approved for a car loan, Dorothy co-signed on a $32,000 SUV loan. Michael made exactly 3 payments before defaulting, and Dorothy ended up paying off the remaining $28,500 to protect her credit score. Vacations were presented as necessary family bonding time that would benefit the grandchildren. The Disneyland trip cost $6,000 for park tickets, hotel, and meals. The next year, they needed to go to Hawaii because Madison was studying Hawaiian culture in school, and it would be educational. That trip cost Dorothy $9,200. The following summer, they drove to the Grand Canyon and stayed in Nice hotels along the way, another $4,300 from Dorothy's account. Every vacation was presented as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity that the children deserved, and Dorothy couldn't bear to deny them these experiences. Home repairs and furniture purchases added thousands more. When their rental house needed a new water heater, Dorothy paid $1,800. When the washing machine broke, she bought them a new one for $900. When they wanted to redecorate the living room, Dorothy gave them $3,500 for a new couch, love seat, and coffee table. When their laptop died, Dorothy bought them a new one for $200. When Madison needed a computer for high school, another $100. The requests were endless, and Dorothy said yes to almost all of them. Birthday and Christmas gifts for the grandchildren were elaborate affairs. Dorothy spent at least $500 per child per birthday, buying the expensive toys and electronics they requested. Christmas was even more extravagant, with Dorothy spending $1,000 per child each year. Over 12 years, birthday and Christmas gifts alone totaled approximately $72,000. Dorothy told herself these were expressions of love, but looking back, she could see they were really attempts to buy affection and gratitude that never materialized. There were also the countless smaller expenses that added up. Groceries when they claimed to be broke before payday, usually $200 to $300 at a time. Gas money when they couldn't afford to fill the tank, $50 to $80 per request. School supplies and activity fees for the kids. Clothing when the children outgrew their wardrobes each season. Emergency vet bills when their dog got sick. Co-pays for doctor visits. Prescription medications. Dance lessons for the girls at $120 per month. Soccer league fees for Tyler at $400 per season. Summer camp fees at $200 per child per summer. Dorothy kept track of every payment in her detailed ledger. By the time Richard died, she'd given them $187,000 in the first 6 years. In the 6 years since Richard died, she had given them another $155,000. That was $342,000 total over 12 years in direct financial support, not counting the value of her free babysitting, which, if she had been paid even minimum wage, would have been another $40,000 easily. She had depleted most of Richard's life insurance money and had been dipping into the retirement account to keep up with the monthly payments. Her own financial security was being systematically destroyed, but she couldn't see it clearly because it happened so gradually. Dorothy kept meticulous records in a ledger, just as Richard had taught her. She wrote down every payment, every transfer, every check she wrote to help Michael and Veronica. When she tallied it up after Richard's death, she'd given them $187,000 in the first 6 years. In the 6 years since Richard died, she had given them another $155,000. That was $342,000 total over 12 years, not counting the value of her free babysitting, which, if she had been paid even minimum wage, would have been another $40,000 easily. She had depleted most of Richard's life insurance money and had been dipping into the retirement account to keep up with the monthly payments. Dorothy's daughter, Susan, had moved to Boston for her job as a software engineer. Susan was financially independent, married to a kind man named David, and they had 2 children of their own. Susan rarely asked Dorothy for anything and had actually offered to help support Dorothy financially after Richard died. But Dorothy had assured her she was fine, never mentioning how much money was flowing to Michael. Susan and Michael didn't have a good relationship. Susan thought Michael was a manipulative leech, and Michael resented Susan for being the successful child who made him look bad by comparison. The trouble had really escalated about 18 months ago, when Veronica convinced Dorothy that it would be easier for everyone if Dorothy moved in with them. They were living in a rented house that cost $3,200 per month, money that Dorothy was essentially paying through her monthly transfers. Veronica suggested that if Dorothy sold her house, they could buy a bigger place together where everyone could live comfortably. The grandchildren could see Dorothy every day, and they could all save money by combining households. Dorothy had been hesitant at first. She loved her house. Richard had built it with his own hands, and every corner held memories of their 37 years of marriage. But Veronica painted such a beautiful picture of multi-generational living, of Dorothy being surrounded by her grandchildren in her final years, of never being lonely again. Dorothy was 67 at the time and starting to feel the weight of living alone in a big house. The maintenance was getting harder, and the loneliness was sometimes overwhelming. Maybe Veronica was right. Maybe it was time to embrace a new chapter. But Dorothy wasn't stupid. She told them she wasn't ready to sell her house yet. Instead, she suggested they buy a bigger rental together, and she would move in for a trial period to see how the arrangement worked. They found a 5-bedroom house in a nice neighborhood for $4,800 per month. Dorothy paid the rent from her account, justifying it as cheaper than maintaining her own house, plus giving Michael his monthly $2,500. She kept her Craftsman house empty, but maintained, paying the property taxes and utilities, about $800 per month total. Living with Michael and Veronica had been difficult from the start. They treated Dorothy more like a live-in nanny than a respected family member. She was expected to watch the children whenever Michael and Veronica wanted to go out, which was often. They went to movies, dinners, bars, and weekend trips, always leaving Dorothy with babysitting duty. When Dorothy tried to make plans of her own, like meeting old teaching friends for lunch, Veronica would suddenly have an emergency appointment, or Michael would have a work obligation that required Dorothy to watch the kids. She cooked dinners that they criticized constantly. The chicken was too dry, the pasta was too bland. Why didn't she make something the kids actually liked? Dorothy, who had been cooking successfully for 50 years and had raised 2 children on her home cooking, found herself doubting her abilities. She started asking what they wanted for dinner, trying to please them, but nothing was ever quite right. Veronica would order takeout after Dorothy had spent 2 hours preparing a meal, claiming the food wasn't what the kids were in the mood for. She cleaned the house while Veronica spent hours on social media and online shopping. Dorothy would vacuum, dust, do laundry, and clean bathrooms while Veronica sat on the couch, scrolling through Instagram and adding items to her cart on various shopping websites. The packages arrived almost daily: clothes Veronica never wore, decorative items for the house, toys for the kids that were played with once and forgotten. Dorothy knew all this shopping was being funded by the money she gave them, but she didn't feel she could say anything. She was living in their rental house, even though she was paying the rent. Michael was rarely home, always claiming to be working on his latest business idea, but Dorothy suspected he was actually just avoiding his family and his responsibilities. When she asked what he was working on, his explanations were vague and constantly changing. One month, it was a cryptocurrency investment opportunity. The next month, it was a multi-level marketing scheme selling health supplements. Then it was a consulting business that never seemed to have any actual clients. Dorothy had been through this pattern enough times to know that none of these ventures would succeed, but she kept hoping that maybe this time would be different. The grandchildren had started to become entitled as well, clearly learning from their parents' example. Madison, at age 12, had the attitude of a spoiled teenager in a reality TV show. She would demand money for clothes and makeup, rolling her eyes when Dorothy suggested she should earn it through chores or good grades. She spoke to Dorothy with open disrespect, saying things like, "You're not my mother, you can't tell me what to do," when Dorothy tried to set any boundaries. When Dorothy refused to buy her a $200 pair of designer jeans, Madison threw her phone across the room and screamed that Dorothy was a terrible grandmother who didn't love her. Tyler, the 9-year-old, threw tantrums when he didn't get his way that were shocking for his age. When Dorothy said he couldn't have ice cream before dinner, he would scream, kick furniture, and call her mean names. Michael and Veronica never disciplined this behavior, instead telling Dorothy she was being too strict or too old-fashioned in her parenting approach. When Tyler's teacher called to report that he had been bullying other children at school, Veronica blamed the school for targeting her son and refused to acknowledge any problem. Emma, the 7-year-old and youngest, had started talking back disrespectfully in ways that broke Dorothy's heart. She would mock Dorothy's accent when she spoke Chinese on the phone to old friends. She would refuse to eat meals Dorothy prepared, demanding fast food instead. She would ignore Dorothy's instructions and then lie about it when confronted. When Dorothy tried to read her bedtime stories like she used to, Emma would say she was too old for baby books and would rather watch videos on her tablet. Dorothy tried to set boundaries, but Michael and Veronica undermined her at every turn, telling the children that Grandma was being mean or unfair. When Dorothy said the kids couldn't have soda with every meal, Veronica would sneak it to them and make a show of it, saying, "Don't tell Grandma, but I think you deserve a treat." When Dorothy said they needed to do homework before screen time, Michael would let them play video games first and tell them, "Grandma just doesn't understand how kids learn these days." It was a deliberate campaign to destroy Dorothy's authority and relationship with her grandchildren. It broke Dorothy's heart to watch her grandchildren being raised with such poor values. She remembered Madison as a sweet toddler who loved being read to and helped bake cookies. She remembered Tyler as a gentle little boy who loved animals and drawing. She remembered Emma as the affectionate baby who always wanted cuddles. Now they were being shaped into miniature versions of their selfish, entitled parents. Dorothy tried to be a positive influence, to model kindness and gratitude, but she was fighting against the constant negative example of Michael and Veronica. 6 months ago, Veronica had approached Dorothy with a new proposal. The rental house was nice, but wouldn't it be better if they owned their own home? They could build equity instead of throwing money away on rent. Veronica had found a beautiful house for sale, a 6-bedroom colonial in an excellent school district listed at $975,000. If Dorothy would use her house as collateral for a down payment loan, they could qualify for a mortgage and buy the new house. Dorothy would still live with them, of course, but they would all own the property together. Dorothy had said no immediately. Her house was her security, her last major asset. Richard had built that house, and she wasn't going to risk it on Michael's unstable finances. Veronica had cried, accusing Dorothy of not trusting them, of not really loving her grandchildren enough to give them a stable, permanent home. Michael had been cold and distant for weeks after Dorothy refused. The children had been coached to make comments about how sad they were that they couldn't have a real home because Grandma wouldn't help. The emotional manipulation had been intense, but Dorothy held firm. She loved her family, but she wasn't going to put her financial security at risk. Veronica had eventually stopped bringing it up, and things had seemed to return to normal. Dorothy continued paying the $4,800 monthly rent, continued giving them additional money for various expenses, and continued being the primary caregiver for her grandchildren whenever Michael and Veronica wanted freedom. She thought the house issue was settled. What Dorothy didn't know was that Michael and Veronica had not given up. They had simply changed tactics. Over the next several months, they executed a careful plan to steal Dorothy's house from her legally. It started with small requests for Dorothy to sign papers. Michael claimed they were refinancing the rental house lease to get a better rate, and he needed her signature as the paying tenant. Another time, Veronica said she needed Dorothy's signature on school enrollment forms for the grandchildren. Each time, Dorothy signed without reading carefully, trusting that her family wouldn't deceive her about what she was signing. What Dorothy had actually signed, buried in stacks of legitimate-looking documents, were papers transferring the deed of her Craftsman house from her name to Michael's name. Michael had forged some documents, manipulated others, and exploited Dorothy's trust to commit deed fraud. By October, Michael legally owned Dorothy's house according to the county records, though Dorothy had no idea this had happened. The house she thought was her security, her nest egg, her final asset, was no longer hers on paper. The truth came out in the most devastating way possible on Christmas morning. Dorothy had gotten up early to make breakfast for everyone, planning a special Christmas celebration. She walked into the kitchen to find Michael and Veronica sitting at the table with serious expressions. Veronica spoke first, her voice cold and businesslike. "Dorothy, we need to talk about your living situation here. It's not working out anymore. You're too controlling with the children, and Michael and I need our space. We think it's time for you to move out." Dorothy had been shocked and hurt, but she tried to stay calm. "If you want me to move out, I'll move back to my own house. That's fine. I can be out by the end of the week." Michael shook his head, and there was something cruel in his smile. "That's the thing, Mom. It's not your house anymore. I own it. We transferred the deed 6 months ago. You signed all the papers. That house belongs to me now, and I'm planning to sell it. The market is hot, and we can get at least $850,000 for it." Dorothy felt like she had been punched in the stomach. "What are you talking about? I never signed over my house. That's impossible." Veronica pulled out a folder of documents and slid them across the table. "You signed right here, and here, and here. 3 different times over the past 6 months. You gave us power of attorney, signed a quitclaim deed, and authorized the transfer. It's all legal and recorded with the county. The house is Michael's property now." Dorothy's hands shook as she looked through the papers. She recognized her signature on multiple documents, but she had thought she was signing rental agreements and school forms, not legal documents transferring her property. "This is fraud. You tricked me. I'll fight this in court. That house is mine. Richard built that house." Michael's expression hardened. "Good luck with that, Mom. You signed everything willingly. No one forced you. The county has accepted all the filings. Possession is 9/10 of the law, and I possess the deed now." The argument had escalated quickly. Dorothy accused them of being thieves and con artists. Veronica accused Dorothy of being a bitter old woman who couldn't accept that her son had finally become successful. Michael told Dorothy she had 1 hour to pack her things and leave. When Dorothy refused, saying she needed time to figure out what to do and where to go, Michael had called a locksmith. He changed the locks on the rental house while Dorothy watched in disbelief, and then he told her she was trespassing and needed to leave immediately, or he would call the police. Dorothy had no choice but to leave the rental house. She stood in the driveway in shock, her suitcase next to her, while her grandchildren watched from the window with confused faces. Madison was crying, but Veronica pulled the children away from the window and closed the blinds. Dorothy got in her car and drove in a daze, not sure where to go. After circling aimlessly for an hour, she drove to her Craftsman house, the home she had lived in for 43 years, thinking at least she could stay there while she figured out what to do. But when she arrived at her house, she found Michael's truck in the driveway. Through the window, she could see Michael and 2 other men inside, presumably movers or friends helping him. They were going through her things, boxing up her possessions. Dorothy tried to unlock the front door with her key, but it didn't work. Michael had already changed these locks too. She knocked on the door, and that was when Michael opened it just a crack and told her this was his house now and she needed to leave. Standing on her own front porch on Christmas morning, locked out of the house her husband had built, Dorothy felt a rage unlike anything she had ever experienced in her 68 years. She was not a confrontational person by nature. She had spent her life being accommodating, being generous, being the peacemaker. But there was something about this moment, this ultimate betrayal by her own son on Christmas morning, that crystallized everything. She was done being a victim. She was done being manipulated. She pulled out her phone and called 911. The dispatcher answered, and Dorothy spoke clearly and firmly. "I need police to come to 2847 Oak Ridge Drive. My son has illegally locked me out of my own home and is refusing to let me in. I believe he has committed deed fraud to steal my property." The dispatcher said officers were on their way and asked Dorothy to wait outside safely. Dorothy sat on the porch steps, her breath coming out in white clouds in the cold December air, and waited for the police to arrive. It took 12 minutes for the EE patrol car to arrive. 2 officers got out, a younger woman named Officer Sarah Mitchell and an older man named Officer James Rodriguez. They approached carefully, taking in the scene of an elderly woman sitting on the porch steps and a younger man visible through the window. Officer Rodriguez spoke first. "Ma'am, can you explain what's happening here?" Dorothy stood up slowly, her knees stiff from sitting in the cold, and launched into her story. She explained that this was her house, that her late husband had built it 43 years ago, that she had lived here until 18 months ago when she moved in with her son temporarily. She explained about the deed fraud, about being tricked into signing documents, about being locked out on Christmas morning. Officer Rodriguez listened carefully, then knocked on the door. Michael opened it, his expression annoyed but trying to appear reasonable. "Officers, thank you for coming. My mother is confused. She has dementia and doesn't remember, but this is my house now. She signed it over to me months ago. I have all the legal documents to prove it." The accusation of dementia made Dorothy's blood boil. "I do not have dementia. I'm a retired teacher with a sharp mind, and I know exactly what happened. My son committed fraud." Officer Mitchell stepped in, her voice calm and professional. "Sir, can you show us the documents you're referring to?" Michael went inside and returned with the folder Veronica had shown Dorothy that morning. He handed it confidently to Officer Rodriguez, clearly believing the paperwork would settle everything in his favor. Officer Rodriguez reviewed the documents carefully while Officer Mitchell asked Dorothy questions about her mental state and memory. Dorothy answered every question clearly and accurately, providing details about her work history, her late husband, her financial contributions to Michael's family. It was obvious to both officers that this was not a confused elderly woman. This was a sharp, coherent person who understood exactly what was happening. Officer Rodriguez looked up from the documents with a frown. "Mr. Chen, these deed transfer documents are concerning. They show transfers that happened in June, August, and October of this year. Can you walk me through why there are 3 separate transfers?" Michael's confidence wavered slightly. "My mother was confused about the process. We had to redo the paperwork a few times to get it right." Officer Rodriguez shook his head. "That's not how property transfers work, sir. You don't file multiple quitclaim deeds for the same property. This looks like someone was trying to create a paper trail to hide fraud. Where's your mother's attorney's signature on these documents? It's unusual for someone to transfer property worth nearly $1 million without legal representation." Dorothy felt a surge of hope. The officer was seeing what she saw, the inconsistencies and red flags in Michael's paperwork. Michael was starting to look nervous. "My mother didn't think she needed an attorney. This was a family matter. I was just trying to help her manage her property since she was getting older." Officer Rodriguez's expression hardened. "Helping her manage her property by transferring it entirely to your name without her understanding? Sir, that sounds like elder financial abuse, which is a felony in Oregon." Michael's face went pale. He clearly hadn't expected the police to side with Dorothy. He had thought that having the deed in his name would be enough, that the legal paperwork would trump Dorothy's complaints. Veronica appeared in the doorway behind Michael, and Dorothy could see the panic in her eyes. Officer Rodriguez continued, "Ma'am, do you have any documentation showing that this was your property before these transfers allegedly took place?" Dorothy suddenly remembered something crucial. "Officer, in my car I have a folder with copies of important documents. My late husband was very organized and kept copies of everything. I have the original deed from 1981 with both our names, the deed transfer after his death that put the house solely in my name, and property tax records showing I've been paying the taxes for 43 years. I also have bank records showing all the money I've given Michael over the years." She hurried to her car, her heart pounding with hope. She retrieved an accordion file from her trunk, one she had grabbed when packing up to move in with Michael and Veronica 18 months ago. Richard had always told her to keep copies of important papers in the car in case of emergency, and she had followed his advice without really understanding why. Now she was grateful for his paranoia. She handed the thick file to Officer Rodriguez, who began going through it methodically. His eyebrows rose as he reviewed document after document. The original 1981 deed showed Richard Chen and Dorothy Chen as joint owners. The 2018 deed filed after Richard's death showed the property transferred to Dorothy Chen as sole owner. Property tax records showed Dorothy had paid taxes on the property every year for 43 years without exception, including the current year. Bank statements showed regular transfers of $2,500 monthly to Michael Chen for 12 years. Receipts showed payments for private school tuition, medical bills, and countless other expenses, all paid by Dorothy for Michael's family. The financial paper trail was devastating in its completeness. Officer Rodriguez looked at Michael with disgust that was visible on his weathered face. "Mr. Chen, based on what I'm seeing here, there's probable cause to believe you've committed elder financial abuse and deed fraud. These documents your mother has contradict your claim that she willingly transferred the property. The multiple deed filings, the lack of legal representation for your mother, the timing of the transfers after you moved your mother into your home, all of this suggests a pattern of manipulation and fraud designed to steal property from a vulnerable adult." Michael's face had gone from pale to red, his neck veins bulging with contained rage. "This is ridiculous. Those are my legal documents. I own this house now. You can't just take my word away based on some old papers my mother kept in her car. Those county deeds are official and recorded. I went through proper legal channels." His voice was rising, becoming more aggressive, and Officer Mitchell's hand moved slightly toward her service weapon in a subtle warning gesture that Dorothy noticed even if Michael didn't. Officer Rodriguez took a step closer to Michael, using his height advantage effectively. "Sir, proper legal channels require full disclosure and informed consent. If your mother didn't understand what she was signing, that's fraud. If you deliberately misrepresented what the documents were, that's fraud. If you took advantage of her trust and your position as her son to manipulate her into signing away her primary asset, that's elder financial abuse, which is a Class B felony in the state of Oregon carrying up to 10 years in prison and a fine of up to $250,000. Officer Mitchell spoke up, her voice firm. "Sir, we're not taking anything away, but we're advising you that you need to vacate this property immediately while this matter is investigated. This appears to be an active crime scene, and you're potentially destroying evidence by moving your mother's belongings." Michael exploded. "This is my house. You can't kick me out of my own property." Officer Rodriguez stepped closer, his hand moving to his belt in a subtle warning. "Sir, you need to calm down. Right now, we have two conflicting claims to this property. Your mother has 43 years of documentation proving ownership. You have recently filed paperwork that appears suspicious. Until this is sorted out by the courts, you need to leave." Veronica finally spoke, her voice shrill with panic. "We have nowhere to go. We gave up our rental house. This was supposed to be our home." Officer Mitchell replied calmly, "That's not a police matter, ma'am. You'll need to find alternative accommodations while this is being investigated. I suggest you start packing up whatever belongings are yours and prepare to leave. If you refuse, we can arrest you for trespassing." The threat of arrest finally broke through Michael and Veronica's resistance. Veronica started crying, but her tears had no effect on the officers, who had clearly seen enough manipulative behavior to recognize it when they saw it. Dorothy stood on the lawn watching as Michael and Veronica hastily loaded their truck with boxes and bags. The two men who had been helping Michael had disappeared as soon as the police arrived, clearly not wanting to be involved in whatever legal trouble was brewing. Officer Rodriguez stayed with Dorothy while Officer Mitchell supervised Michael and Veronica's departure. "Ma'am, I'm going to give you the contact information for Adult Protective Services and for a real estate attorney who specializes in deed fraud. You need to file a formal complaint and get a lawyer involved immediately to reverse these fraudulent transfers." Dorothy took the business cards he offered, her hand still shaking but now from relief rather than fear. "Officer, thank you. I thought I had lost everything. I thought my own son had successfully stolen my home." Officer Rodriguez's expression was kind but sad. Elder financial abuse is one of the most common crimes we see, and family members are the most frequent perpetrators. "I'm sorry this happened to you, but you did the right thing by calling us and by keeping good records. Those documents you have might have just saved you from losing everything." After an hour, Michael and Veronica had loaded everything they could carry and drove away in their truck, giving Dorothy hateful glares as they left. Officer Mitchell did a final check of the house to make sure nothing had been vandalized or stolen. Then return Dorothy's house key that Michael had been forced to surrender. The locks have been changed, so this key won't work anymore. You'll need to call a locksmith to get back in. In the meantime, I recommend you file a restraining order against your son and daughter-in-law to prevent them from returning to the property. Dorothy called a 24-hour locksmith company, grateful that some businesses operated even on Christmas Day. While she waited for the locksmith, she called her daughter Susan in Boston. Susan answered cheerfully, clearly in the middle of Christmas morning celebrations with her own family. "Mom, Merry Christmas, how are things?" Dorothy started crying before she could answer, and the whole terrible story came pouring out. Susan was silent for a long moment after Dorothy finished, and when she spoke, her voice was cold with fury. "I knew Michael was bad, but I didn't think even he would sink this low. Mom, I'm booking a flight right now. I'll be there tomorrow. Don't worry about anything. We're going to fix this." Susan's immediate support meant everything to Dorothy. She wasn't alone. She had one child who genuinely loved her, who wasn't trying to steal from her or manipulate her. They talked for another 20 minutes, with Susan asking detailed questions about the paperwork and the police response. By the time they hung up, Dorothy felt stronger, more capable of facing what came next. The locksmith arrived and changed all the locks on the house, installing new deadbolts on every door. Dorothy paid the $380 fee from her debit card, adding it to the mental tally of costs from this nightmare. She finally entered her house, the home Richard had built with his own hands, and found it in disarray. Michael and his friends had clearly been going through everything, and her belongings were scattered everywhere. She spent the rest of Christmas Day cleaning up and taking inventory of what might be missing. It appeared Michael had taken some of Richard's tools from the garage and several pieces of furniture, but overall the damage was minimal. That evening, Dorothy's neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, knocked on the door with a plate of Christmas cookies and a concerned expression. "Dorothy, I saw the police here this morning. Is everything all right?" Mrs. Henderson was 75 years old and had lived next door for 30 years. She had known Richard, had attended his funeral, and had been one of the few people who quietly disapproved of Dorothy's endless financial support of Michael. Dorothy invited her in and told her everything. Mrs. Henderson listened with growing outrage, and when Dorothy finished, she shook her head firmly. "I should have said something years ago. I watched you give that boy everything, and I watched him take and never give anything back. But I didn't want to interfere in family business. Now I wish I had been pushier." She reached over and took Dorothy's hand. "You listened to me. You did nothing wrong. You were a loving mother and grandmother. They took advantage of that love, and that's on them, not on you. You hold your head high." The kindness from Mrs. Henderson, combined with the support from Susan and the justice delivered by Officers Rodriguez and Mitchell, gave Dorothy something she hadn't felt in years: hope. She had spent so long being the one who gave support that she had forgotten what it felt like to receive it. That night, she slept in her own bed in her own house for the first time in 18 months, and despite the trauma of the day, she slept more soundly than she had in years. There was something about being in her own space, surrounded by Richard's memory, and free from Michael and Veronica's manipulation, that brought her deep peace. Susan arrived the next day with her husband David, having left their children with David's parents so they could focus on helping Dorothy. Susan had already contacted a real estate attorney named Karen Walsh, who specialized in deed fraud and elder abuse cases. They had an appointment scheduled for December 27th. Susan also brought her laptop and spent hours helping Dorothy organize all her financial documents, creating a detailed timeline of every payment, every transfer, every request for money over the past 12 years. The evidence was overwhelming. The meeting with attorney Karen Walsh was eye-opening. Karen was a woman in her mid-50s with sharp eyes and a reputation for aggressive representation of elder abuse victims. She reviewed Dorothy's documents for 2 hours, asking pointed questions and taking extensive notes. When she finished, she sat back and folded her hands on her desk. "Mrs. Chen, You have one of the strongest cases of elder financial exploitation I've seen in my 25-year career. The paper trail is incredibly clear. Not only did your son and daughter-in-law commit deed fraud, but they also appear to have violated several Oregon elder abuse statutes. Karen explained the legal process ahead. First, we file an emergency motion to void all the deed transfers as fraudulent. Given the documentation you have, I'm confident we can get those reversed quickly. Second, we file a civil lawsuit against Michael and Veronica for the $342,000 they took from you over 12 years. Oregon law allows for treble damages in elder abuse cases, which means you could potentially recover over $1 million. Third, I'm going to recommend that the district attorney's office file criminal charges for theft, fraud, and elder financial abuse, which are felonies carrying significant prison time. Dorothy felt overwhelmed by the scope of what Karen was describing. I don't want my son to go to prison. I just want my house secured in my name, and I want to stop being a victim. Karen's expression softened. I understand that impulse, Mrs. Chen. He's your son, and despite what he's done, you still love him. But here's what I need you to understand. If there are no consequences, Michael and Veronica will do this again. Maybe not to you, but to someone else's parent or grandparent. They're predators who have spent 12 years perfecting the art of financial manipulation. Justice isn't just about you. It's about protecting the next victim. The words hit Dorothy hard because she knew Karen was right. If she let Michael and Veronica walk away from this with no consequences, they would absolutely find another vulnerable person to exploit. Her grandchildren would grow up thinking this behavior was acceptable. The cycle would continue. Dorothy straightened her shoulders and looked Karen in the eye. Do whatever needs to be done. File everything. I want full accountability. Susan squeezed her mother's hand proudly. That's my mom. I knew you had steel in your spine. Over the next 3 weeks, Karen Walsh moved with impressive speed. She filed an emergency motion in court to void the fraudulent deed transfers, attaching 75 pages of evidence, including the original deeds, tax records, bank statements, and sworn affidavits from Dorothy and Officer Rodriguez. Michael and Veronica hired their own attorney, a man named Richard Foster, who was known for defending white-collar criminals. Foster filed a response claiming that Dorothy had willingly transferred the property and was now experiencing seller's remorse. But his arguments were thin and unconvincing in the face of Dorothy's overwhelming evidence. The hearing was held in mid-January before Judge Marianne Foster, an experienced jurist known for her zero tolerance of elder abuse. Dorothy testified first, walking the judge through the entire history of her financial support of Michael and Veronica, the deceptive papers she had been asked to sign, and the Christmas morning confrontation. She brought her ledger showing every payment made over 12 years, and the judge took time to review it carefully. Judge Foster's expression grew increasingly stern as she read through the financial history. Michael testified next, and his story fell apart almost immediately under cross-examination by Karen Walsh. Karen forced him to admit that he had never explicitly told Dorothy she was signing over the deed. She forced him to admit that he had presented the documents mixed in with other papers. She forced him to admit that he had planned to sell the house without telling Dorothy until after the sale was complete. With each admission, Michael looked smaller and more guilty. Veronica didn't testify at all, with their attorney advising her to invoke her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination, which only made them look more culpable. Judge Foster's ruling came swiftly and harshly. Having reviewed all the evidence presented, this court finds clear and convincing proof of deed fraud and elder financial abuse. The quitclaim deeds filed by Michael Chen are hereby voided in their entirety. The property at 2847 Oak Ridge Drive is restored to sole ownership by Dorothy Chen. Furthermore, I am issuing a permanent restraining order preventing Michael Chen and Veronica Chen from coming within 500 feet of Dorothy Chen or her property. This court is appalled by the predatory behavior exhibited by the defendants toward a vulnerable family member, and I am recommending that the District Attorney's Office pursue criminal charges to the fullest extent of the law." Dorothy felt tears of relief streaming down her face as the judge spoke. Her house was truly hers again. Susan hugged her tightly while Karen Walsh gathered the official court orders. Michael and Veronica left the courtroom without looking at Dorothy, their attorney rushing them out before anyone could ask questions. As they exited, Dorothy heard Veronica hiss at Michael. "This is all your fault. You said this would work. You said she would never fight back." The mask had completely fallen away, revealing the cruel opportunist beneath. The civil lawsuit for financial damages moved more slowly, as these cases typically did. Michael and Veronica filed for bankruptcy to try to avoid paying, but Oregon law prevented discharge of debts arising from elder abuse. The bankruptcy judge ruled that the $342,000 debt was non-dischargeable, meaning Michael and Veronica would owe it no matter what happened with their other creditors. Karen Walsh filed liens against any property they might acquire in the future and set up wage garnishments that would take 25% of any income either of them earned until the debt was paid. The criminal case was perhaps the most satisfying outcome. The district attorney, a tough prosecutor named Marcus Johnson, filed charges of theft in the first degree, criminal fraud, and elder abuse in the first degree against both Michael and Veronica. The charges carried potential sentences of up to 10 years in prison. Facing the reality of significant prison time, Veronica broke first. She agreed to testify against Michael in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony revealed that the entire scheme had been Michael's idea, planned over months, and that he had studied deed fraud techniques online before implementing them. With Veronica's testimony, the case against Michael was overwhelming. His attorney negotiated a plea deal where Michael would plead guilty to fraud and elder abuse in exchange for a sentence of 4 years in prison with possibility of parole after 18 months. Veronica received 2 years with possibility of parole after 1 year. Both were ordered to pay restitution of $342,000 jointly, though Karen Walsh had warned Dorothy that collecting the money might take decades or might never happen fully. The criminal sentences were really about justice and accountability, not about recovering money. At the sentencing hearing, Dorothy was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. She stood at the podium and looked at Michael and Veronica, seeing strangers where her son and daughter-in-law used to be. "You took my money, my trust, and nearly took my home. But the worst thing you took was 12 years of my life that I spent enabling your dysfunction instead of living fully. You taught my grandchildren that manipulation and greed are acceptable. You dishonored the memory of my late husband who worked so hard to provide security for me. I hope you use your time in prison to think about the kind of people you've become and to make different choices in the future." Michael's face was stony and showed no remorse, but Veronica was crying, and Dorothy wondered if those tears were real or just more manipulation. The judge imposed the agreed-upon sentences, and Michael and Veronica were taken into custody immediately. Dorothy watched them being led away in handcuffs and felt no satisfaction, only sadness. This was her son, the baby she had held and raised and loved. But he had made his choices, and now he had to face the consequences. The question of the grandchildren weighed heavily on Dorothy. Madison, Tyler, and Emma had been placed temporarily with Veronica's sister while their parents were in prison. The sister, named Rosa, had reached out to Dorothy cautiously, saying the children missed their grandmother and asking if Dorothy wanted visitation. Dorothy had been torn. She loved those children deeply, but she also knew they had been raised with terrible values and had witnessed their parents' manipulation for their entire lives. After much thought and discussion with Susan and Karen Walsh, Dorothy decided to maintain limited contact with her grandchildren through supervised visits once a month. She would not provide financial support beyond small birthday and Christmas gifts. She would not enable their sense of entitlement, but she would be present as a positive example of a person with integrity and boundaries. Rosa seemed to understand and appreciate Dorothy's conditions. The first visit was awkward, with Madison angry and distant, Tyler confused and sad, and Emma clingy and scared. But Dorothy hoped that with time and consistency, she could help them understand what had really happened and guide them toward better choices than their parents had made. 18 months after that terrible Christmas morning, Dorothy was living a completely different life. She had her house secured in her name with no encumbrances. She had cut ties with Michael and Veronica completely. She maintained monthly visits with her grandchildren, but with firm boundaries and no financial support. She had joined a support group for victims of elder financial abuse and had become an advocate, speaking at community centers about warning signs and prevention strategies. She had reconnected with old teaching friends and had taken up watercolor painting as a hobby. Susan visited from Boston several times a year, and their relationship had deepened through the trauma and recovery. David had become like a real son to Dorothy, supportive and kind without any agenda. Dorothy's grandchildren from Susan were being raised with strong values and genuine respect for their grandmother. Dorothy had also grown closer to Mrs. Henderson next door, and they had coffee together twice a week, two elderly widows who understood each other's loneliness and joys. Dorothy's finances had stabilized as well. Without the constant drain of supporting Michael and Veronica, she was able to live comfortably on her pension and investment income. She had even been able to take a trip to Hawaii with Susan and David, something she and Richard had always talked about doing but never managed before he died. She stood on a beach in Maui watching the sunset and felt Richard's presence, knowing he would be proud of how she had finally stood up for herself. The house that Richard built remained Dorothy's sanctuary. She spent hours in the garden he had planted, maintaining the roses and adding new flower beds. She repainted rooms in colors she loved, erasing the last traces of the violation she had experienced. She displayed photos of Richard prominently, along with pictures of Susan and her family. There were a few pictures of her grandchildren from Michael, but noticeably none of Michael or Veronica. Those relationships were over, possibly forever. Dorothy thought often about the police officers who had helped her that Christmas morning, especially Officer Rodriguez, who had taken the time to really listen and investigate. She had written commendations for both officers to their department, praising their professionalism and compassion. Officer Rodriguez had later told her that her case had inspired the department to provide better training on elder abuse recognition and response. Dorothy felt that if some good could come from her nightmare, that was it. Looking back on the 12 years of manipulation and exploitation, Dorothy could see all the red flags she had missed, the constant financial emergencies that never seemed to end, the way Michael and Veronica always had a crisis right when Dorothy might have started questioning their requests, the isolation from Susan and other family members who might have asked hard questions, the gradual escalation from small requests to massive monthly payments, the emotional manipulation using the grandchildren as leverage. All the classic signs had been there, but Dorothy's love for her son and her loneliness after Richard's death had made her vulnerable. Dorothy had learned that being a good mother didn't mean enabling bad behavior. It didn't mean bankrupting herself to support adult children who refused to support themselves. It didn't mean accepting abuse and manipulation in the name of family unity. Real love included boundaries, consequences, and sometimes tough choices that felt cruel but were actually necessary. She wished she had learned these lessons earlier, before $342,000 in 12 years had been wasted, but she was grateful to have learned them at all before it was too late. On the second anniversary of that Christmas morning confrontation, Dorothy held a small celebration at her house. She invited Susan and David, Mrs. Henderson, the members of her elder abuse support group, and attorney Karen Walsh, who had become a friend. They toasted with champagne to survival, to justice, to second chances, and to the power of standing up for yourself, even when it's terrifying. Dorothy made a speech thanking everyone for their support and ended with words she had been saving for this moment. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I had lost everything to people I loved and trusted. But what I actually lost was an illusion. The illusion that family loyalty means accepting abuse. The illusion that being a good mother means being a doormat. The illusion that I was powerless. What I gained was so much more valuable. I gained self-respect. I gained real relationships based on mutual care rather than financial transactions. I gained the knowledge that I am strong enough to fight back and win. I gained freedom. The room erupted in applause, and Dorothy felt a sense of pride and accomplishment that was entirely her own. My name is Dorothy Chen. I am 70 years old now, and I have learned that protecting yourself is not selfish, it is essential. I learned that people who truly love you will respect your boundaries, not constantly push against them. I learned that money represents your security, your labor, your future, and you should guard it carefully even from family members who claim to need it. Most importantly, I learned that it is never too late to stand up for yourself, to say enough is enough, and to demand justice. The police couldn't believe what I showed them that Christmas morning because the documentation was so thorough and the betrayal was so complete. But that documentation saved me. Keep records, trust your instincts, set boundaries, and never, ever let anyone make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. If you liked my story, you can support me by making a donation so I can write more stories. Thank you in advance. And you, what would you do in this person's place? I would love to hear your opinion, so please share it with me in the comments. I'm always curious about what you all think, and also write me where you heard this story. For more life stories like this, like the video and subscribe to my channel. There are many other stories waiting for you, with heartfelt greetings. Until next time.